George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He grew up on a tobacco plantation, the son of Augustine and Mary Washington. His childhood was not one of luxury, but of modest plantation life, where discipline and hard work shaped his early character. When George was just 11 years old, his father died. This loss forced him to grow up quickly. Without the opportunity for a formal education in England, as his older brothers had, he learned practical skills close to home. He studied mathematics, surveying, and the land, lessons that would later serve him both as a soldier and a leader. The Virginia frontier was a rugged, dangerous place. Washington spent much of his youth outdoors, developing a deep connection with nature and an understanding of the challenges of wilderness life. From an early age, he showed a quiet determination and sense of responsibility that set him apart. This beginning, humble, disciplined, and shaped by hardship, forged the foundation for the man who would one day lead a revolution and a nation.
As a teenager, George Washington began working as a land surveyor, a profession that demanded precision, toughness, and independence. At just 16 years old, he joined a surveying expedition into the rugged Shenandoah Valley. Days were long, food was scarce, and the wilderness was unforgiving, but Washington thrived. He quickly earned a reputation for accuracy and reliability. Surveying was more than measuring land. It meant facing swollen rivers, harsh weather, and encounters with Native American tribes. It taught him resilience, leadership, and the ability to make decisions under pressure. By 17, Washington had secured an official post as the surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia. This work brought him both money and respect, and it introduced him to influential circles of Virginia society. More importantly, it gave him a deep knowledge of the American frontier, its geography, its dangers, and its opportunities. These years as a surveyor hardened him physically, trained him in discipline, and prepared him for the challenges of war and leadership that lay ahead.
In his early 20s, George Washington stepped onto the stage of global conflict during the French and Indian War, the North American front of a struggle between Britain and France. In 1754, at just 22 years old, he was sent to deliver a warning to the French who were building forts in the Ohio Valley. His mission soon escalated into violence at the Battle of Jumonville Glen, where his men ambushed a French party. The clash ignited war, and Washington suddenly found himself at the center of it. But his inexperience showed. Later that year, he hastily built Fort Necessity, only to be surrounded and forced into surrender, the only time in his life he formally capitulated. The defeat was humiliating, but it became one of his most important lessons in humility, preparation, and leadership. Washington went on to serve as a volunteer aide to British General Edward Braddock in 1755. During the disastrous expedition against the French at Fort Duquesne, Braddock was fatally wounded. Amid chaos and heavy casualties, Washington's courage stood out. He rallied survivors and helped save the remnants of the army. 4 bullets tore through his coat, yet he was left unharmed, cementing his reputation as a man of almost providential protection. These early experiences taught Washington both the brutality of war and the necessity of discipline, strategy, and patience. The French and Indian War forged him into a leader prepared for even greater challenges.
After the French and Indian War, Washington returned to Virginia as a respected officer, but also a man deeply changed by what he had seen. Britain's arrogance toward colonial officers, treating them as second class compared to regular British troops, left a lasting impression. As the years passed, tensions grew between Britain and its American colonies. Taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, imposed without colonial representation, stirred resentment across the colonies. Washington, though not as fiery as men like Samuel Adams, became a firm critic of British policies. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he quietly but firmly supported resistance. Washington wasn't a radical calling for independence from the start. Instead, he pushed for dignity, rights, and fair treatment for the colonies. But as Britain's grip tightened, his resolve hardened. By the early 1770s, Washington had become a leading voice in Virginia, known for his integrity, calm judgment, and ability to unify others. He lived as a wealthy planter at Mount Vernon, but beneath the surface, he was preparing for a larger role. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and Washington's reputation as a disciplined soldier and principled leader positioned him as a natural choice when the colonies would soon need someone to lead their fight for liberty.
In 1775, as the colonies edged closer to full-scale war with Britain, the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to decide their course. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord had already drawn blood, and the need for a unified military leader was urgent. All eyes turned to George Washington. He was respected, experienced, and, crucially, a Virginian. Choosing him would unite the northern and southern colonies in the cause. Washington, dressed in his military uniform, made a quiet but powerful statement of readiness. But Washington did not seek glory. When formally nominated as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he responded with humility. He declared he did not feel equal to the task and refused to accept a salary, asking only to be reimbursed for expenses. Despite his doubts, Washington accepted the burden out of a deep sense of duty. He knew the army was poorly equipped, undisciplined, and facing the most powerful military force in the world. Yet he believed the fight for liberty was worth any sacrifice. With that appointment, Washington's life and America's future changed forever. He left Philadelphia for Boston to take command, stepping into a role that would test every ounce of his strength, patience, and resolve.
When George Washington took command of the Continental Army outside Boston, he inherited a force that was more a crowd than an army. Farmers, laborers, and volunteers, poorly trained and badly supplied. At first, the war saw successes, but soon came crushing defeats. In 1776, Washington faced his greatest test. The British, reinforced by a massive fleet and thousands of soldiers, launched an assault on New York. Washington's forces were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The Continental Army was driven from the city, retreating through New Jersey, morale collapsing with every step. Desertion soared. Supplies ran dangerously low. Many believed the revolution was finished before it had truly begun. Members of Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing capture. Even within Washington's ranks, confidence wavered. But Washington refused to surrender hope. He understood that survival itself was a form of victory. We must avoid a decisive defeat, he reasoned, knowing the revolution's future rested not on winning every battle, but on keeping the army alive to fight another day. These early struggles revealed Washington's greatest strength: endurance. Though beaten and nearly broken, he held the army together by sheer will, setting the stage for a daring comeback that would shock the world. By the winter of 1776, the revolution seemed doomed. Washington's army was starving, freezing, and dwindling with every passing day. Many enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. If the soldiers went home, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. But Washington refused to let the cause die. He planned a bold, desperate strike,
a surprise attack on the Hessian forces stationed at Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas night, in the midst of an icy storm, Washington led his men across the frozen Delaware River. The crossing was treacherous. Ice floes battered the boats, and bitter winds cut through ragged clothing. Yet by dawn, his army reached the opposite shore. At Trenton, they struck with ferocity. The Hessians, caught off guard after a night of celebration, were overwhelmed. The victory electrified the colonies, proving that the revolution still lived. But Washington was not done. Days later, at Princeton, he led another daring maneuver, outflanking British forces and securing another triumph. These victories were small compared to the might of the British Empire, yet their impact was enormous. They reignited hope, rallied support for the cause, and transformed Washington from a commander on the brink of failure into a symbol of resilience and bold leadership. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge became one of the most defining chapters in Washington's story. The Continental Army, weary from defeats and constant marches, set up camp in the frozen Pennsylvania wilderness. Supplies were scarce. Men went barefoot in the snow, wrapped rags around their feet, and many starved. Disease swept through the camp, claiming thousands of lives. To outsiders, it looked like the revolution would collapse under the crushing weight of misery. But Washington held the army together. His presence gave the men a reason to endure. He rode among them daily, sharing in their struggles, a leader who would not abandon his soldiers in their darkest hour. Out of this suffering came transformation. Washington welcomed the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben, who brought discipline and modern European drilling to the ragged troops. The men who stumbled into Valley Forge broken and hungry emerged in the spring as a trained, unified, and determined fighting force. Valley Forge was more than just survival. It was a rebirth. It proved that resilience and sacrifice could shape an army of farmers and volunteers into soldiers capable of standing against the world's most powerful empire. While Washington and his men endured the freezing winter at Valley Forge, diplomacy was unfolding across the Atlantic. The Continental Congress had sent Benjamin Franklin to France, hoping to persuade the French to support the American cause. France, still bitter from its defeat to Britain in the 7 Years' War, was watching closely. The turning point came after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where American forces secured a crucial victory. This triumph convinced France that the rebellion had real potential. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States and entered the war as an ally, providing money, supplies, soldiers, and, most importantly, naval power. For Washington, the French alliance was a lifeline. It gave legitimacy to the revolution and shifted the balance of power. Britain, once the dominant force, suddenly faced a global conflict. Washington now had hope. His ragged army was no longer alone. The alliance with France marked a tide turning in the war. What had begun as a desperate struggle by scattered colonies was now an international fight for liberty, with Washington at its center. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 long years, but Washington saw an opportunity to deliver a final blow. British General Lord Cornwallis had entrenched his army at Yorktown, Virginia, believing the Royal Navy would protect him. What he didn't know was that the French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, had already blocked the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, with French General Rochambeau, marched his troops south in a brilliant deception, leaving the British in New York thinking they were the target. After a grueling march of over 400 miles, the combined American and French armies surrounded Yorktown. For 3 weeks, they pounded the British defenses with relentless artillery fire,
Trenches closed in, redoubts fell, and escape was impossible. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The world watched in astonishment. A ragtag army of colonists, led by George Washington, had defeated the most powerful empire of the age. Though peace would not be official until 1783, Yorktown marked the true end of the Revolutionary War. Washington, ever humble, refused to take all the credit, but for his soldiers and his nation, this was the triumph of a lifetime.
After the stunning victory at Yorktown, many expected George Washington to seize power and perhaps even rule as a king. His soldiers adored him, and the new nation seemed fragile and uncertain. But Washington had a different vision. In 1783, after the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war, Washington stunned the world. At the Maryland State House in Annapolis, he appeared before Congress to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. With calm dignity, he declared that his duty was finished and that he wished to return to his farm at Mount Vernon. This single act set Washington apart from countless conquerors in history. Rather than clinging to power, he gave it up willingly. The gesture shocked monarchs across Europe, who could not imagine a victorious general surrendering authority. For the American people, Washington's resignation was the ultimate proof of his character. He had fought not for personal glory, but for liberty. By returning to private life, he demonstrated that the United States would be a republic, not a monarchy. It was this rare humility combined with his strength that would cement Washington as the father of his country.
After several years of fragile independence, it became clear that the United States needed more than the weak Articles of Confederation to survive. The nation was divided, debt-ridden, and vulnerable. In 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to create a stronger foundation for the young republic. At the center of it all stood George Washington. Though he longed for the peace of Mount Vernon, his reputation for honesty and unity made him the unanimous choice to preside over the Constitutional Convention. His very presence gave legitimacy to the gathering, reassuring both delegates and citizens that their work would not serve personal ambition, but the nation's future. Washington rarely spoke during the debates, but his influence was enormous. His calm authority kept order, while his reputation reminded delegates that compromise was essential. Without his steady hand, the fragile alliance of states might have collapsed into conflict. By the end of that summer, the United States Constitution was born, a document that would reshape history. Washington had once again proven that leadership is not always about words or force, but about presence, trust, and guiding by example.
In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. Though he had hoped to retire, he understood that the nation needed him once more. With no guidebook to follow, Washington stepped into uncharted territory, shaping the very office of the presidency. From the start, he set vital precedents. He chose a cabinet of advisors, blending strong personalities like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to balance differing visions for the nation. He established the president's role as one of restraint and dignity, rejecting pomp and monarchy, while still commanding respect at home and abroad. Washington also defined limits to power. By serving only 2 terms, he voluntarily stepped away from leadership, creating the tradition that no president should rule for life. This act cemented the principle that in America, leaders serve the people, not the other way around. Through humility, discipline, and foresight, Washington transformed the presidency from an uncertain experiment into a respected institution. Every president who followed would walk in the path he first laid.
Washington's presidency was far from smooth. The young republic was fragile, torn between competing visions of the future. Hamilton's push for a strong central government clashed with Jefferson's belief in states' rights and agrarian democracy, igniting the first deep political divisions in America. He also faced direct tests of federal authority. The most famous was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when farmers in western Pennsylvania rose in protest against a federal tax. Instead of letting the rebellion fester, Washington personally led troops into the field, sending a clear message that the new government would enforce its laws. On the global stage, Europe's wars threatened to drag America into conflict. Britain and France both pressured the United States to take sides. Washington resisted, insisting on neutrality, believing the fragile nation could not survive entanglement in foreign wars. Balancing unity at home and independence abroad was no easy task, but Washington's steady hand kept the republic intact, proving that democracy could survive its early storms.
As Europe erupted into chaos with the wars of the French Revolution, George Washington faced one of the greatest challenges of his presidency: how to keep America out of foreign entanglements. Many Americans sympathized with revolutionary France, while others leaned toward Britain, the old colonial power. The young republic risked being pulled into a global conflict it was not prepared to fight. In 1793, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain impartial in the wars of Europe. This decision was controversial, drawing criticism from both Jefferson's pro-French supporters and Hamilton's pro-British faction. Yet Washington held firm, believing that survival depended on staying independent of Old World rivalries. His neutrality policy also shaped foreign relations. The Jay Treaty with Britain helped avoid war, though it angered many who saw it as too conciliatory. Still, Washington's diplomatic restraint gave the fragile nation precious time to grow stronger. By choosing peace over passion, Washington established a precedent. America should chart its own course, free from the constant battles of Europe.
George Washington, the man who fought for liberty and independence, lived with a contradiction at the heart of his life. He was a slaveholder. Born into Virginia's plantation society, Washington inherited enslaved people from his family and later acquired more through marriage to Martha Custis. By the time he became president, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked on his Mount Vernon estate. Yet, Washington's views on slavery were not static. Over time, he grew increasingly uneasy with the institution. He prohibited the sale of enslaved families at Mount Vernon, attempted, though often unsuccessfully, to find ways to ease their lives, and privately expressed his hope that slavery would eventually end. Unlike many of his peers, Washington took a personal step toward change. In his will, he ordered that the enslaved people he directly owned be freed after his wife's death. Still, the contradiction remains. The father of liberty helped secure independence for a nation while denying freedom to many within it. This paradox continues to shape how we understand Washington, not just as a hero, but as a man of his time, struggling with moral complexities that echo into the present. In 1796, as George Washington prepared to step down from the presidency, he delivered what became one of the most influential political speeches in American history, his farewell address. Though never spoken aloud, it was published in newspapers. It carried the weight of his authority and the wisdom of experience. In it, Washington warned against the dangers of political factions, cautioning that party spirit would divide the nation, pit citizens against one another, and erode unity. He feared that partisan conflict would invite corruption and weaken the very democracy they had fought to establish. The farewell address was both a personal goodbye and a roadmap for the future, a plea for unity, caution, and balance. For decades afterward, it was read annually in Congress, a reminder of the founding generation's hopes and fears for the young nation.
After leaving the presidency in 1797, George Washington returned to his beloved home at Mount Vernon, eager to spend his final years as a farmer rather than a statesman. He immersed himself in agriculture, managing his estate with the same discipline he had brought to the battlefield and the presidency. Washington experimented with crop rotation, soil improvement, and innovative farming methods, making Mount Vernon a model of efficiency. But retirement was not just about farming. Washington remained a figure of immense influence, corresponding with leaders at home and abroad, offering guidance and watching closely as the fragile republic he helped create took its first steps without him. He also faced the contradictions of his legacy, particularly his relationship to slavery. Though he relied on enslaved labor at Mount Vernon, Washington struggled with the moral dilemma it posed. In his will, he made the unprecedented decision to free the enslaved people he directly owned upon his wife's death, setting an example that few of his peers followed. At Mount Vernon, Washington found peace in the land he loved, reflection in his writings, and a sense of closure after decades of service. His retirement was not just an ending, but a final chapter of leadership by example, demonstrating that true greatness lies in knowing when to give up power.
On December 12, 1799, George Washington rode across his plantation in cold, wet weather to oversee work. 2 days later, he developed a severe throat infection that quickly worsened. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, who used the common but harmful practice of bloodletting, Washington's condition deteriorated rapidly. On the night of December 14, surrounded by Martha and close aides, Washington faced death with the same composure he had shown in life. His final words were calm instructions about his burial, and then, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." The news of his passing spread quickly, and the nation plunged into deep mourning. Memorial services were held across the young United States, with leaders and ordinary citizens alike grieving the loss of the man they saw as the father of their country. Even foreign nations paid tribute, recognizing his role not only as a revolutionary leader, but also as a symbol of Republican virtue. Washington's death marked the end of an era. He had led a revolution, forged a new government, and then stepped aside, an act of humility that set him apart from kings and conquerors. In death, as in life, he remained the standard by which leadership would be measured.
George Washington's legacy reaches far beyond the battles he fought or the office he held. He became a living symbol of unity, a leader who bound together a fragile nation at its most uncertain moment. By refusing kingship, limiting his presidency, and placing the republic above personal ambition, he set standards of restraint, humility, and duty that shaped the very identity of the United States. Washington's influence extended into every corner of American life. His commitment to civic virtue inspired future leaders to view power not as a privilege, but as a responsibility. His farewell address continued to guide generations, warning against partisanship and reckless foreign entanglements. His example of voluntary retirement reinforced the idea that leaders must serve the people, not themselves. Abroad, Washington's life was studied as proof that a new kind of leadership was possible, one built not on hereditary rule, but on merit, sacrifice, and trust. In the century since his death, his name has remained a touchstone of American identity, the father of his country. Washington's true legacy lies not only in what he achieved, but in the precedent he left behind, that the preservation of liberty depends on leaders who put the nation above personal gain. His enduring influence continues to remind Americans what it means to lead with honor.
It is better to be alone than in bad company. A reminder that integrity matters more than popularity. Happiness and moral duty are inseparably connected. For Washington, true contentment came only through responsibility. Discipline is the soul of an army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak, and esteem to all. His belief that order and training outweighed sheer numbers. Guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, a warning that false loyalty can be as dangerous as open betrayal. To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace. His philosophy of strength as a safeguard, not aggression. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. Washington saw freedom as fragile at first, yet unstoppable once nourished. 99% of failures come from people who make excuses, a call to accountability and perseverance. Let your heart feel for the afflictions and distress of everyone. His reminder that leadership is rooted in empathy. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph, a reflection of his own struggles during the Revolution. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience, perhaps his most timeless advice, that character is the foundation of freedom.